August 8, 1940. In the Kuren Naval Arsenal, Japan, work begins on the largest battleship ever constructed. The project is shrouded in extreme secrecy. Workers sign oaths never to discuss what they're building. Aerial observation is blocked by massive rope screens hiding the dry dock. Foreign intelligence agencies know Japan is building battleships, but have no idea of their true size and power. The ship being built is the Yamato. When completed, she will displace 72,000 tons, mount 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever put to sea, and be protected by armor up to 26 inches thick. She will be larger, more powerful, and more heavily protected than any battleship ever built by any nation. She represents Japan's attempt to offset American industrial superiority through technological supremacy. One Yamato would be worth 2 or 3 American battleships. This is the story of the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, the ultimate expression of battleship design. It's about Japan's desperation to create a weapon that could challenge American naval dominance. It's about magnificent engineering applied to a strategically flawed concept. Most importantly, it's about the largest battleships ever built, weapons that represented both the peak and the end of the battleship era. The strategic context. To understand why Japan built the Yamato, we must understand Japan's strategic situation in the late 1930s. Japan was an island nation, totally dependent on imported resources. Oil, iron, rubber, and other materials essential for modern warfare had to be imported, much of it through areas controlled or influenced by hostile powers. Japan's economy and military were dwarfed by the United States. American industrial capacity was roughly 10 times Japan's. In a prolonged war, American material superiority would be decisive. Japan's only hope was a short, victorious war that would establish a defensive perimeter and force America to negotiate peace rather than pay the cost of defeating Japan. The Japanese Navy understood this strategic reality. They believed their only chance was to achieve such overwhelming superiority at the war's start that America would be unable to contest Japanese control of the Western Pacific. This required weapons that could defeat American forces in decisive battle. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and subsequent London naval treaties limited battleship construction. Japan was allowed to build fewer capital ships than America or Britain. These treaties were designed to prevent an expensive naval arms race and maintain strategic stability. However, Japan viewed them as attempts to lock in Western superiority. In 1936, Japan refused to renew the London Naval Treaty. In 1937, they began designing battleships unconstrained by treaty limitations. The goal was simple: build battleships so powerful that ton for ton they would overwhelm any opponent. Quality would offset quantity. Admiral Yamamoto's vision. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, one of Japan's most brilliant naval officers, was paradoxically both a supporter and a critic of the Super-Battleship program. Yamamoto understood aircraft carriers, not battleships, would dominate future naval warfare. He had lived in America, understood American industrial capacity, and believed war with America was unwinnable in the long term. However, Yamamoto also understood Japanese naval culture and strategic thinking. The battleship fleet was the core of Japanese naval power and prestige. Battleship admirals dominated the Navy's leadership. Arguing against battleships was career suicide and strategically unrealistic given the political realities. Yamamoto's solution was compromise: build both super-battleships and carriers. The super-battleships would satisfy the battleship advocates, and provide a powerful last resort weapon. The carriers would provide the actual offensive capability. The Super-Battleship program was approved, with Yamato and Musashi initially, and additional ships planned. Revolutionary design. The Yamato-class design was revolutionary in scale and ambition. The specifications were staggering. The main armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch Type 94 naval rifles in 3 triple turrets. These were the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship. Each gun weighed 165 tons without the breech. Each shell weighed 3,200 pounds, more than a small car. The guns could fire these massive shells over 26 miles. The explosive force and armor penetration were unmatched by any other naval weapon. The armor protection was equally massive. The main belt was 16 inches thick, sloped inward to increase effective thickness against shells. The deck armor was up to 9 inches thick to defeat plunging shells at long range. The turret faces were 26 inches thick, the thickest armor ever mounted on a warship. The conning tower had walls 19.7 inches thick. The Yamato was designed to survive hits from her own guns, the ultimate measure of battleship protection. The displacement was approximately 72,000 tons fully loaded, making Yamato and Musashi the heaviest warships ever constructed. The length was 863 feet. The beam was 127 feet. The hull was enormous, dwarfing every other battleship. The propulsion system generated 150,000 horsepower, driving 4 propellers, giving a top speed of 27 knots. This was slower than many contemporary battleships, but deemed adequate for the Yamato's role as a decisive battle weapon rather than a raiding vessel. The secondary armament included 12 6.1-inch guns for use against cruisers and destroyers, and initially 12 5-inch guns for anti-aircraft defense. The anti-aircraft armament would be dramatically increased as the war progressed and the air threat became apparent. The fire control systems were sophisticated, using optical rangefinders with base lengths up to 50 feet, the longest ever installed on a warship. The Japanese believed superior optics and fire control would allow Yamato to engage and destroy enemies at ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. Construction challenges. Building the Yamato presented unprecedented engineering challenges. The sheer size of components required new manufacturing techniques. The 18.1-inch guns had to be manufactured in specially constructed facilities. The armor plates were so large and thick that producing them required new forging equipment. The dry dock at Kure Naval Arsenal had to be enlarged to accommodate the massive hull. Special cranes were built to lift the enormous turrets and gun assemblies. The construction employed thousands of workers and consumed vast quantities of steel, materials Japan could ill afford to divert from other needs. The secrecy was extraordinary. Workers were compartmentalized, each group knowing only their specific task. The massive rope screens hiding the construction from aerial observation were constantly maintained. Foreign diplomats and journalists in Japan were kept away from Kure. The deception was successful. Western intelligence estimated the new Japanese battleships at about 45,000 tons, far below their actual size. Yamato was launched on August 8, 1940, and commissioned on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor. Musashi was launched November 1, 1940, and commissioned August 5, 1942. 2 more ships, Shinano and Hull 111, were laid down but never completed as battleships. Shinano was converted to an aircraft carrier, the largest ever built until modern supercarriers, but was sunk by submarine before becoming operational. Hull 111 was scrapped incomplete. The irony of timing. The Yamato's completion in December 1941 came at exactly the moment when her strategic relevance vanished. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, executed by carrier aircraft, demonstrated that carriers, not battleships, would dominate the Pacific War. The 6 Japanese carriers involved in Pearl Harbor inflicted more damage in hours than all the world's battleships could have achieved. Throughout 1942, carrier battles, Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, decided the war's direction. Battleships played supporting roles at best. The decisive weapon was the aircraft carrier. The YAMATO, for all her power, couldn't project force the way carriers could. She could only fight enemies within gun range, while carriers could strike targets hundreds of miles away. The Japanese Navy's leadership was slow to accept this reality. They continued to plan for the decisive battle, where their battleships would destroy the American fleet. They held the YAMATO in reserve, preserving her for this climactic engagement. Meanwhile, the war moved on without her. American carrier task forces ravaged Japanese positions, while YAMATO sat in port, a fleet in being that never quite found the battle she was built for. Service record: the reluctant warrior. YAMATO's combat record is surprisingly brief and anticlimactic for such a powerful ship. It participated in the Battle of Midway in June 1942, but only as part of the distant support force. It never engaged enemy ships. The battle was decided by carriers before the battleships could even reach the combat area. In early 1943, YAMATO sailed to Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, serving as flagship for the combined fleet. She remained there for months, occasionally sortying, but never engaging in combat. American submarines prowled the area, making movement dangerous. Fuel shortages limited operations. YAMATO, designed to decide the war, spent most of her time at anchor. In December 1943, YAMATO was damaged by an American submarine torpedo. The damage wasn't critical, but it required return to Japan for repairs. She spent months in dry dock, while additional anti-aircraft guns were installed, reflecting the growing air threat. In October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf offered the decisive surface engagement Japan had awaited. YAMATO, along with Musashi and other battleships, sorted as part of a complex plan to destroy American amphibious forces in the Philippines. The plan relied on using carriers as decoys to draw away American carriers, allowing Japanese battleships to attack the vulnerable landing forces. The plan worked tactically, but failed strategically. Musashi was attacked by wave after wave of American carrier aircraft. She absorbed incredible punishment, torpedoes and bombs, before finally sinking. YAMATO survived the air attacks and penetrated to within range of American escort carriers, protecting the landing area. In the battle off Samar, YAMATO finally engaged in surface combat. However, the targets were escort carriers and destroyers, not the American battleships she was designed to fight. The Japanese had a devastating advantage, but failed to exploit it effectively. Confused command decisions, American destroyer torpedo attacks creating smoke and confusion, and eventual Japanese withdrawal meant YAMATO inflicted minimal damage before retreating. It was an inglorious performance for the world's most powerful battleship. The final mission, Operation Tengo. April 1945. The war is lost. American forces have captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa. B-29 bombers are destroying Japanese cities. The Navy has almost no fuel. Most carriers are sunk or unusable. The war will end soon, and Japan will be defeated. Admiral Toyota, Command Fleet, plans Operation Tengo, a suicide mission. YAMATO will sail to Okinawa with only enough fuel for a one-way trip.
She will beach herself and use her massive guns to destroy American forces ashore. When her ammunition is exhausted, her crew will abandon ship and join the ground defenders, fighting to the death. It's a desperate, essentially hopeless plan. Yamato will sail without air cover against overwhelming American air power. The mission is essentially a suicide attack, sacrificing the battleship and her crew for minimal strategic gain. Yet Japanese military culture demands the gesture. Yamato cannot sit idle while Japan faces defeat. On April 6, 1945, Yamato sailed from Japan with a small escort, the cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. No carriers provided air cover. The force had no chance of reaching Okinawa.
April 7, 1945. Beautiful clear weather. Perfect flying conditions. At 12:32 p.m., American aircraft appeared. Nearly 400 planes, torpedo bombers and dive bombers, attacked in coordinated waves. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns, greatly increased since construction, fired desperately. The sky filled with flak, but there were too many attackers. Torpedoes struck Yamato's port side. Bombs crashed through her decks. The armor that could stop battleship shells couldn't stop torpedoes below the waterline. Water flooded the engine rooms. The ship listed. Damage control teams fought to control flooding, but it was hopeless. More attacks came. More torpedoes hit. The list increased. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. Fires raged. At 2:05 p.m., the order came to abandon ship. At 2:23 p.m., Yamato capsized and sank. Her forward magazines exploded in a massive blast visible for miles, creating a mushroom cloud that rose thousands of feet. Of her crew of 3,322 men, only 269 survived. Over 3,000 men died, including Admiral Ito, who'd led the force. The cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers were also sunk. It was a massacre, not a battle. What went wrong? The Yamato story is a tragedy of misplaced faith in obsolete technology. Japan poured enormous resources into creating the ultimate battleship precisely when battleships were becoming irrelevant. The fundamental problem was strategic. Battleships require proximity to enemy ships to be effective. In the Pacific's vast distances, carrier aircraft could strike targets hundreds of miles away. A battleship might have 30-mile gun range, impressive for naval artillery. But carrier aircraft had 300-mile range. The battleship was outranged 10-1. Tactically, battleships were vulnerable to aircraft and submarines. Yamato's massive armor stopped shells, but was less effective against torpedoes striking below the waterline. Her anti-aircraft armament, though constantly increased, couldn't stop determined air attacks. Operationally, Yamato consumed resources Japan couldn't afford. The fuel required for operations was needed elsewhere. The steel used in construction could have built multiple carriers or hundreds of aircraft. The crew of over 3,000 highly trained men represented an enormous investment in training and expertise. Strategically, Japan needed carriers and aircraft, not battleships. Every resource devoted to Yamato was wasted from a strategic perspective. Japan's best chance of extended resistance lay in carriers and land-based aircraft. The super-battleships were magnificent, but irrelevant. Technical excellence, strategic failure. Yet we must acknowledge the engineering achievement. The Yamato represented the peak of battleship design. Her armor scheme, gun design, and overall construction were excellent. Had she been built in 1920, she would have been revolutionary and strategically valuable. In 1941, she was an anachronism, a magnificent example of technology that warfare had bypassed. The 18.1-inch guns were engineering marvels. They worked as designed, were accurate, and could have devastated any enemy battleship. But they never fought another battleship. The armor was the thickest ever installed, but it couldn't stop submarines or aircraft, the actual threats. The Yamato and Musashi consumed approximately 2% of Japan's entire steel production during critical war years. That steel, devoted to carriers and aircraft, might have extended Japanese resistance significantly. Instead, it created two ships that achieved nothing strategically significant. American discovery and analysis. After the war, American naval intelligence pieced together the Yamato's specifications from Japanese records and survivor accounts. The Americans were stunned. They'd known Japan was building large battleships, but had underestimated by almost 50%. The true size and power of the Yamato class shocked even experienced naval officers. American analysts concluded that had Yamato fought American battleships in a surface engagement, she probably would have won. Her guns outranged American battleships. Her armor was thicker. Her fire control was excellent. In a traditional battleship duel, Yamato was superior to any American battleship, possibly superior to any two American battleships. But this superiority was meaningless. The Americans would never have allowed a surface engagement. They would have used carrier aircraft, submarines, or overwhelming numbers to destroy Yamato without exposing their own battleships to her guns. The Pacific War was fought by carriers and submarines. Battleships were supporting actors. The wreck, discovery, and memorial. The Yamato's wreck lies in approximately 1,120 feet of water off Okinawa. In 1985, a Japanese expedition located the wreck using side-scan sonar and underwater cameras. The images showed the massive hull broken into sections, scattered across the seafloor. The forward section is relatively intact. The midsection, where the magazine explosion occurred, is devastated. The stern section lies separately. The wreck site is officially designated a war grave. Over 3,000 men died when Yamato sank. Japanese memorial services are held annually. The wreck is protected from salvage and disturbance. In 2005, the 50th anniversary of Yamato's sinking, a major museum dedicated to the ship opened in Kure, Japan, where she was built. The Yamato Museum includes a massive 1:10 scale model of the battleship and extensive exhibits about her history. It's become a major tourist attraction and memorial visited by hundreds of thousands annually. Cultural legacy in Japan. The Yamato holds complex significance in Japanese culture. It represents both technological achievement and tragic waste. The ship's name, taken from an ancient name for Japan itself, carries cultural weight. Yamato symbolizes Japanese spirit, determination, and ultimately, sacrifice. The story of Yamato's final mission resonates in Japanese culture. The deliberate sacrifice, sailing to certain death for honor rather than practical effect, exemplifies aspects of Japanese military culture that modern Japan both honors and questions. The ship represents both pride in Japanese engineering and recognition of war's futility. Books, films, and documentaries about Yamato are popular in Japan. The ship appears in numerous fictional works. The anime film Yamato, The Last Battle, and others present dramatized versions of her story. She's become a cultural icon representing World War II's Pacific theater. Lessons learned. The Yamato story offers important lessons about technology, strategy, and conflict. Both as an engineering achievement and as a strategic failure, it offers insights about the dynamics of military power and innovation. First, technology must be relevant to the strategic circumstances of conflict. Old technology, no matter how refined, cannot compete with new and more effective weapons. A battleship could not win the fight against a carrier.
Second, strategy and tactics must be aligned with the nature of the war. A war dominated by aircraft and submarines requires tactics and technology focused on those assets. That is where the Japanese investment should have gone. The battleships remained relevant for surface engagements, but they were not key assets for the Pacific War. Third, resource allocation is critical. War is fought with resources: fuel for aircraft, men for units, steel for shipbuilding, etc. Resources spent on the wrong technology or for the wrong strategy are wasted. Allocating too many resources to the Yamato and its sister ship harmed Japan's overall war effort. Fourth, human sacrifice does not model achievement. The Yamato mission was signed off by the emperor himself, but the whole mission was a failure. A sacrifice and loss of life did not produce important military results. In fact, the sacrifice hurt the cause of resistance by destroying ships and sending essential air personnel to an end. Fifth, innovation is critical for military success. The allocation of resources to technology that doesn't work in the modern war prevents innovation in areas that could be used for achievement. A country, army, or marines need to invent to be successful in the modern war.
What lessons can we draw from the Yamato story? First, technological superiority doesn't guarantee strategic success. Yamato was technologically superior to any opponent in her specific domain. But that domain was no longer relevant. Strategic context matters more than technical capability. Second, sunk costs are real. Japan continued investing in battleships even after evidence showed carriers were dominant. Institutional momentum, cultural preference, and unwillingness to abandon expensive projects led to continued investment in obsolete platforms. Third, warfare evolves faster than weapons procurement. Yamato was designed for a type of warfare that had already become obsolete by the time she was completed. Long development cycles in weapons systems create risk that the strategic environment will change before the weapon enters service. Fourth, resources matter. Japan's limited industrial capacity meant every resource devoted to battleships couldn't be used for carriers, aircraft, or other needs. Resource allocation decisions have strategic consequences. Fifth, cultural factors influence military decisions beyond rational analysis. Japan's battleship-focused naval culture influenced force structure despite rational arguments favoring carriers. Understanding military culture is essential to understanding military decisions. Comparing to other battleships. How does Yamato compare to other World War II battleships? The American Iowa-class battleships, roughly contemporary with Yamato, displaced about 58,000 tons fully loaded, significantly lighter than Yamato. Their 16-inch guns were smaller than Yamato's 18.1-inch guns, with less penetrating power and range. Their armor was thinner. In a theoretical surface engagement, Yamato would likely defeat an Iowa. However, the Iowas were faster, at 33 knots versus 27 knots for Yamato. They were more efficient, requiring less fuel and maintenance. They were more practically useful, serving as carrier escorts and shore bombardment platforms. 4 Iowas were completed. Only 2 Yamatos saw service. The Iowas survived the war and served for decades afterward. British King George V class battleships were smaller still, about 45,000 tons. Their 14-inch guns were significantly less powerful than Yamato's. They couldn't have survived a surface engagement with Yamato, but they were available in larger numbers and served effectively in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. German Bismarck and Tirpitz were closer to Yamato in concept, attempting to create qualitative superiority. At about 50,000 tons, they were large but still smaller than Yamato. Both ships had limited strategic impact, similar to Yamato. Neither survived the war. The Yamato was the ultimate battleship. She was also the ultimate example of a weapon type whose time had passed. The end of an era. Yamato and Musashi represented the end of battleship dominance in naval warfare. They were the largest, most powerful battleships ever built. They were also the last battleships whose primary purpose was fighting other battleships. After World War II, no nation built battleships for battleship versus battleship combat. Some battleships were completed from wartime construction programs, but they were rapidly retired. The American Iowas were reactivated multiple times for shore bombardment and cruise missile platforms, but never to fight other battleships. The aircraft carrier became the dominant naval weapons platform, a position it still holds. Nuclear submarines became the undersea equivalent. Surface combatants became primarily anti-aircraft and anti-submarine escorts for carriers. The battleship's role disappeared. The Yamato story thus represents the end of an era. For over 400 years, since ships first carried cannon, the ship of the line, the vessel powerful enough to stand in the line of battle, dominated naval warfare. For the last 80 years of that era, the battleship was the ultimate expression of naval power. Yamato was the ultimate battleship. Her destruction by carrier aircraft symbolized the transition to a new era of naval warfare. Conclusion. The battleship Yamato was a technological marvel, the most powerful warship ever built for surface combat. She represented the peak of battleship design: massive guns, thick armor, sophisticated fire control, and enormous size. No battleship could match her power. Yet she was strategically irrelevant, built for a type of warfare that was already obsolete by the time she was completed. She spent most of her career in port. Her few combat sorties achieved nothing significant. Her final mission was a suicide attack that sacrificed 3,000 men for no strategic gain. She represents both the peak and the futility of battleship development. Japan invested enormous resources in Yamato and Musashi, resources desperately needed elsewhere. The steel, the labor, the trained crew, all would have been more valuable devoted to carriers, aircraft, or submarines. The super-battleships were magnificent failures, achieving nothing commensurate to their cost. For the men who served aboard her, the Yamato was their ship, their home, their responsibility. They served her faithfully until she sank beneath them. Over 3,000 men died when Yamato went down, joining over 3,000 more who died when Musashi sank. Their sacrifice deserves remembrance, even as we recognize the strategic futility of the ships they served. The Yamato remains fascinating because she represents an ending. She was the last of something, the ultimate expression of an idea that was becoming obsolete even as she was built. She was magnificent, powerful, beautifully engineered, and completely irrelevant to how the war was actually fought and won. In naval museums worldwide, models of Yamato draw crowds. People are fascinated by superlatives, the biggest, the most powerful, the ultimate expression of a concept. Yamato was all of these. She was also a cautionary tale about technology, strategy, and the evolution of warfare. She was the greatest battleship ever built, and her story is inseparable from the story of battleships becoming obsolete.